You guys, if you have come to our conference over the past, I don't know, decade, I don't know how many years it's been, then you are very familiar with our first presenter, Scott Graves. He is a fan favorite. He keeps getting asked to return. I'll do an introduction and hand it over to Scott. Hello, Scott. He is the Director of Research of the California Budget Center, who will give us an overview of the state budget and how the events of 2020 will influence policy and funding priorities in 2021 and beyond. Scott joined the Budget Center in 2002 and has served as Director of Research since 2014. In this role, he oversees the Budget Center's analytical work, conducts research and analysis related to health and human services and corrections, and is the organization's lead analyst on the state and county budget processes. Scott has covered a number of other policy areas at the Budget Center, including childcare, preschool, and housing. And prior to joining the Budget Center, he worked as a researcher in Austin, Texas. And he was also a California Executive Fellow as a reporter for newspapers in Arizona and California. He received a PhD, Dr. Graves did, in political science from the University of Texas at Austin and a bachelor's degree in government and journalism from Cal State University, Sacramento. Please welcome our first presenter on the state budget, Scott Graves. Scott, it's great to see you.
Hi, Jordan. Thank you. You can hear me, right? I always have to check that first.
You are good. We can hear you. We can see you. And I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for asking me and the California Budget and Policy Center to participate once again in your annual conference. I know last year, there was an obvious shutdown and no conference, but I think I've been participating in your conferences every year since 2007 or 2008. And I really enjoy speaking to your audience. And I hope that a year from now, we'll be able to do this in person again. But for now, meeting via Zoom, maybe we're actually reaching out to more people than we ever have before on these very important issues. So first of all, I have to note, it is St. Patrick's Day. I am wearing green. Wanted to confirm that. It's my socks, so you can't see it. And I am reporting to you from my home office, which is my bedroom in Sacramento, where I have been working for the last year. I'm hopeful that my organization will return to the real office sometime later in 2021. For now, though, all of us, my colleagues and I, are doing our work, our good work on state budget and policy issues that are really aimed at improving the lives of Californians with low and middle incomes. We've been doing that work from our own homes for the last year. And what I want to do today is to provide a pretty high-level update on what's going on with the state budget here in California in mid-March, just a couple of months away from a final budget deal for the upcoming fiscal year. So let me go ahead and share my screen so you can see my slides. Can someone confirm that my slides are viewable?
They are.
Awesome. Okay, I'll go full screen. Okay. So I guess to put it at the highest possible level, I want everybody to know that we have some sobering news, obviously, and we also have some good news. So sometimes in the past, I've come to this conference only with bad news, and I always apologize for that. This time, of course, there is sobering news because we're still in the midst of an incredibly deadly pandemic. Vaccines are not available to everyone yet, but there is hope and there is light at the end of the tunnel. In terms of the state budget, many of you who were paying attention last year will recall that policymakers here in Sacramento were trying to figure out how to solve a massive projected budget shortfall for this fiscal year. As I'll talk about in a moment, things have not been as bad as analysts here in Sacramento had anticipated. And that's actually good news for Californians in what is otherwise a very difficult time for millions of people. So let me just focus first on moving to my first slide here on what we already know and what we're all living through is that in California and throughout the nation, we're really facing twin crises. We're facing the deadly COVID-19 pandemic that has claimed so many lives here in California and throughout the nation. And we're also facing the recession that resulted from the pandemic and the necessary shutdown of the economy in order to control the spread of the virus and reduce the number of people who became sick or died or would have died as a result. What we do know about these twin crises is that they are disproportionately affecting Californians with low incomes, particularly people of color and women. Basically people who already faced systemic inequities even before the pandemic began a year ago. These are the people who have been especially affected by the incredibly challenging times that we're living through. And just to share with you one data point that I don't have on my slide, California, as many of you may realize, has lost an incredible number of jobs as a result of the recession. Even as of last December, so just a few months ago, we were still down 1.5 million jobs compared to February of last year. So we actually lost more jobs. Some jobs came back, but we were still down well over 1 million jobs at the end of 2020 compared to near the beginning of that same year. As a result of that, we've seen just incredible disruption in people's lives. And it's important to remember also that during the Great Recession of over 10 years ago, we did not lose that many jobs at the depths of that recession. So in many ways, the times that we're living through now in terms of job losses and lost income are far more devastating for millions of Californians, particularly those with low incomes, than we saw a decade ago during the prior recession. So having said that though, I did want to let everyone know that we do have some good news in California. There's always some good news, right? And so in terms of what's happening here in Sacramento in revenues, I hope that everyone, if you're not already aware, I want you to be aware that revenues have been coming in to the state treasury much higher than had been expected a year ago, even 6 or 7 months ago. I'm not going to get into the numbers here, get into the weeds. You can follow up with me later on that. I just want to point out that the devastating revenue shortfall that policymakers thought we would be facing a year ago has not come to pass. Essentially, California, largely because well-off people, the wealthiest Californians, continue to do well and continue to pay taxes at the rates, progressive rates we have in California. Because of that, revenues are coming in much better than expected, and this gives policymakers in Sacramento the opportunity to invest in Californians at a time when those investments are very much needed. So essentially, we're not looking at a situation where people in Sacramento are trying to figure out how to cut more. Instead, they are trying to figure out how to deliver the most help possible to the Californians who need that help right now during the pandemic and the recession. So that is a much better place to be than we thought we'd be 6 or 9 months ago. I also want to highlight the fact that President Biden and Congress have come through for the American people. It's been widely publicized that Congress approved the American Recovery Act, I think that's what it's called, something like that, that is providing almost $2 trillion in various forms of relief across the country These are dollars that are going to go directly to individuals and go to businesses and to state and local governments to help get us through this pandemic and to soften the impacts of this recession. So one example that many of you may already be aware of is most Americans will qualify for checks of $1,400 per person. So if you are an individual and your income is lower than $75,000 per year, you will soon be receiving a check for $1,400 per person from the federal government. The federal government is also going to provide billions of dollars to states and local governments. For example, California will receive $26 billion from this federal relief package. Cities and counties together will receive $16 billion. So that's well over $40 billion coming from the federal government to state and local governments in California that can be used to offset the impact of the recession and to help Californians in many different ways. So I guess the bottom line on this is that in terms of revenues, things are really looking up for California during what is otherwise a very dark time. Moving on to my next slide, I wanted to briefly highlight a couple of downsides here. Of course, it's sort of like I'm paddling the canoe. I'll tell you a little bit of good news on one side, then I'll move the paddle to the other side and tell you a little bit of bad news. So without getting much into the weeds here, I wanted to highlight a couple of challenges for the state budget on the horizon. The first challenge is that many people don't realize California's state constitution actually has a spending limitation. I'm not going to get into the weeds of it, but it basically says we're only allowed to spend so much from our revenues in a particular year. And if we go over that, there are certain consequences, which I'm not going to try to explain right now. California, this limit is called the Gann limit because Paul Gann, back in 1979, was the person who was instrumental in getting this initiative on the ballot, and the voters approved it. So essentially, we are living with a spending limitation put in effect back in the late 1970s by California voters. This could have an impact on our ability as a state to spend dollars that are needed to pay for vital services. We're going to find out more about this when the governor releases his revised budget in May. For now, I just want to put it on your radar, if you haven't heard, that this is a potential issue in terms of the state's ability to invest state dollars in much needed services, this spending limitation that we may be in danger of going above. The second thing to keep in mind is that although the revenue situation for the current year and heading into the next fiscal year that begins on July 1st looks pretty good, especially compared to what we thought it would be last year, state analysts are projecting that California will likely face deficits in the years beyond. So in other words, in the very near term, things are looking up. When you start to look at 2, 3, 4 years down the road, there's a concern here in Sacramento among policymakers that California's expenditures will exceed California's revenues. In other words, we're going to spend more than we're likely to take in taxes, which means we're going to have deficits that will open up and grow over time. Now, these are just projections, right? We don't know that this is going to happen, but it is what analysts think is likely to happen. As a result of that, both of these factors, the spending limitation problem and the possibility of deficits in future years, bolsters Governor Newsom's position that most new spending through the state budget should be one time and not ongoing, meaning the governor has been saying, and some state legislators have been saying, please don't come to us with proposals to spend money ongoing this year, next year, the year after that, and beyond. Please come instead with creative ideas on how to spend money this year and the coming fiscal year in a way that will make an impact, a positive impact in California, but not necessarily committing the state to spending those same dollars year after year after year, because they are worried about the GAN spending limitation and about the possibility of deficits. So switching to my next slide, this largely explains why the governor's budget proposal that was released in January focuses mainly on one-time spending. So the new initiatives in the governor's budget that are around homelessness and public health spending are mainly intended to commit the state to spending in a single year, not to spend ongoing year after year. We also saw the same focus on one-time spending in what some people have called the early action state budget deal that was reached last month. Many of you may have heard that the legislature and Governor Newsom took early action related to the state budget to address the many tremendous needs that we see here in California. They committed billions of state tax dollars on a one-time basis to help with things like reopening schools and many other things. They also included what they were calling Golden State stimulus payments. These are essentially one-time $600 payments to many Californians with low incomes, including recipients of SSI, SSP, cash assistance, and also recipients of CalWORK's welfare to work assistance. So millions of Californians will benefit from these $600 payments, and policymakers recognize that undocumented Californians who contribute so much to our state's economy and society have been left out of previous federal COVID relief packages. And as a result, they committed some state dollars to help undocumented families with low incomes to get through this economic and health crisis. These undocumented individuals or households can qualify for up to $1,200 in one-time state fiscal relief as a result of this package that was passed by the state legislature about a month ago. So that was the early action that was taken on the state budget this year.
Scott, if I could break in for just 1 second and read off our code to receive your MCLE credit. The code is 7864. Again, that code is 7864. Thanks so much.
All right, everybody, write that code down, 7864. So I have a couple more slides here, and then if there's time, I would be happy to entertain questions. What I just wanted to highlight toward the end of my presentation here are the fact that our state's leaders are facing what we're calling oddly disconnected budget realities in California. So for example, we know that the economy is performing very well for some Californians. For example, people who are as fortunate as I am to have held on to their job and their income, able to work safely from home. Many people who are making much more than I am, who have lots of money in the stock market, basically who are working with millions and billions. These Californians have been doing very well, and in fact, even better during this pandemic, corporations as well, than they were even prior to the pandemic and the recession. So it's sort of an out of balance situation where those in California who were already doing well are either fine or doing much better than ever. Whereas millions of Californians, particularly people of color and women, have found themselves out of work or having lost income in one way or another, who are worried about keeping a roof over their heads, putting food on the table, getting new clothes for their kids. All the things that families worry about, those worries have only built up for millions of Californians as a result of sort of this two-tier recession that we see. Not bad or even better for those at the top, just about everyone else really suffering. We also see this disconnection with our revenue picture, where, as I mentioned earlier, because the state budget, the state revenue picture is looking better than we had thought, and we have lots of new dollars that will be coming in from the federal government to support programs and services and that will provide direct assistance to individuals. We're seeing some really good and positive news in the short term, but when you go out 2, 3, or 4 years, there are concerns that that's not going to last, that state spending is going to outpace the revenues that we receive at the state level. And as a result, there could be deficits opening up, which means it makes it harder for state policymakers to commit to ongoing expenditures that will show up down the road and potentially widen the state's projected budget deficits. And finally, there's been a lot of talk here about the need, to just get back where we were. If we could only get back to where we were, on March 1st, 2020, everything would be well. Everything would not be well for many people. We have realized even before the pandemic that there were many systemic inequities, particularly affecting Black and Latinx Californians and other people of color, inequalities, inequities that were not being addressed then. So if we just get back to, quote, normal, we're still going to end up leaving millions of families behind and struggling to make ends meet and wondering about their future here in California. So while policymakers need to keep their eye on the near term, at the same time, they need to be thinking about how do we recover from this in a way that's positive and that we can restructure so that we build a more equitable California instead of just going back to what we had before. My last slide here, I just wanted to point everyone ahead toward the process here related to the state budget in California. As many people realize that the legislature has been holding budget hearings on what I would call warp speed. If you have paid attention to the process in prior years, often the legislature's budget committees do not begin to hear the governor's proposals for the upcoming fiscal year until sometime in March. They actually this year began their budget hearings in January and in both the Assembly and the Senate, and they are continuing those budget hearings today, although they're probably going to be wrapping them up sometime during the month of March. So they're moving very quickly to hear what the governor has proposed for the upcoming fiscal year and to think through what is the legislature's response, what should California's budget look like for the fiscal year that begins on July 1st. A couple of deadline notes here. The governor, by state law, is required to release a revised budget by May 14th. That's the famous document that's known as the May revision. Essentially, that gives the governor a second bite at the apple. The governor gets to come out with essentially a new or updated budget proposal that says, hey, here's how I think we should be spending California's tax dollars in the coming year. This document is going to be very important this year, even more so than ever, I think, because it's going to lay out the governor's vision for how to use the money coming from the federal government through the recent federal relief package. This is the $26 billion coming directly to the state of California, as well as other funding that will be distributed through the state budget. As always, the state legislature is required by the state constitution to pass the budget bill by midnight on June 15th. So that's another key deadline to be watching out for. That's only about 3 months away, so we're getting relatively close to the end of the process here. And I always like to remind people that once the budget deal is enacted by the governor and the legislature in June, that doesn't mean it's the end of the process. Every year, they come back in August and September, and even months after that, and make more changes to the state budget, either by adding new spending or adding new trailer bills, as they're called, that change the law in some way, and they use the budget process to do that, which is why it's always important to watch the state budget process throughout the year, rather than just thinking, oh, they did the budget in June, now I can stop paying attention and I don't have to worry about it again until January. In fact, if you want to influence the budget process, it's really critical to be thinking about and engaged with that process throughout the year. So I'm going to end on that note. I just have a closing slide here that shows how you can get in contact with me. We provide lots of technical assistance at the California Budget and Policy Center. So if you have questions about anything related to the state budget or state policy, please feel free to reach out to me and I will attempt to answer the question for you. Or if I feel I can't answer it, I'll put you in touch with one of my many smart colleagues, or we'll send you off to someone else in the world who we think will be able to help you out. So once again, thank you for inviting me to participate in your conference. And if we have time, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Scott, thank you so much. We do have a few questions and a few minutes left for those questions. And as always, your presentation just summed everything up so quickly and so clearly. One question is regarding the analysts and the projections. We see a little tension, perhaps, that the out years are showing. Some are saying, yeah, that looks really bad and we shouldn't have any spending that is ongoing spending. There's some others that are saying, no, it's going to be just fine. So can you, and you're right in the middle of that, you're talking with all these people. So can you kind of explain a little bit of that tension and what people should be listening to and how we could talk with lawmakers about it?
Okay, so I think what you might be referring to, Jordan, is many folks on the call here may realize the legislature has their own fiscal advisors who are known as the Analyst's Office, the Legislative Analyst's Office, or LAO. Of course, the governor has his own fiscal people, the Department of Finance, or DOF. In many years, and they're both great organizations, very trustworthy people. There's no fake news here. They only put out real numbers. But people can differ, right? People can look at the same, part of the world and see something different. In this case, that has happened in the past. But this year, both the LAO and the Department of Finance are kind of on the same page. They have both pointed toward the likelihood that the state will face deficits in what are called the out years, meaning 2, 3, or 4 years from now. So this is a year in which there's not necessarily a big disagreement between the legislature's advisors and the governor's advisors. One thing that I often like to remind people, though, is while one-time spending can be a bummer, right? Because everybody wants ongoing spending. You want to be able to get your program committed to on an ongoing basis. One thing that an advocate recently told me that has stuck with me is, Scott, it's only one time until the next time. So what advocates can often do is accept the fact that this is a one-time year, and then be prepared to go back in 2, 3, 4, 6, 8 months from now, arguing for a continuation of those dollars or an expansion of those dollars or making them ongoing. So I guess what I like to remind people is we never really know how the numbers are going to shake out down the road. But the legislature and the governor are kind of on the same page, saying this is a tough year for approving ongoing expenditures. Then it seems like you want to make the best of the situation. Go for one time if you need to. Know that you can come back and ask for one time again next year, right? It's only one time until the next time. And maybe think about creative ways to use these new federal dollars that will be flowing to California and that do not have to be spent in a single year. The state can hold on to them for a while, and maybe figure out how to allocate them across multiple years, which could sort of be like ongoing spending if you can use those federal dollars for at least a certain number of years. So I think this is a year in which advocates should try to figure out how to be really creative about the one-time aspect and also about the new federal money that California and local governments will be receiving.
Thank you. And what you're mentioning about new federal money, we're going to have a conversation about that tomorrow in our Lanterman Coalition session, because we were just notified that, yes, home and community-based services got a 10% FMAP increase. So hundreds of millions of dollars for 1 year. And we're going to talk about that next year, but it's only one-time spending, but how we can spend it, that may be up for discussion. We're over time, but this is an interesting question. Can you do it in 30 seconds or less, Scott? If there is a recall election, how will that affect the budget, if at all?
Probably the main impact is going to be on the time leading up to the recall. If this recall actually is scheduled for an election later this year, there's a very strong likelihood that it will color everything that happens in Sacramento, right? There will be a great concern among the governor and his staff about whether doing A, B, C, D, or E is going to somehow push the voters over the edge and result in his removal from office. So it doesn't seem likely that a recall would be effective, meaning that if the governor is on the ballot in a recall, are Californians really going to recall him? I don't really think so, but I think it has more to do with the period leading up to that, ensuring that the governor doesn't get himself in more hot water one way or another.
Well, Scott, there's some great other questions. We'll make sure to answer them as well as we go on, people. Great questions, and I'll send them to you as well, Scott. Yes, Scott is independent. The Budget Policy Center is independent from the legislature and the governor. It's an independent organization, and we'll make sure. And if you wouldn't mind, in the chat, Scott, to all the attendees, there's some people asking for your contact info on that last slide as we move on. Would really appreciate it. Otherwise, Scott, thank you so much. Year after year, you bring us education and information that we can be equipped with in our tools for advocating for the disability community. Thanks so much again for being with us.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'll include my contact info in the chat, and have a great rest of your conference.
Thanks so much, Scott.